Hi, I'm Alicia Daniel, and it's a beautiful early day in April here in Burlington. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Master Naturalist, and I would love to take you out on a walk to meet some of my favorite trees. We're at Rock Point, beautiful landscape, lots of tree diversity. And as we go through the morning, I want to help you identify some of the more common trees and how to tell things that look alike apart from each other. And as you gain that knowledge, I would love to encourage you to go out and start to think about the forests that are near you and help yourself begin to understand and read those forested landscapes. So there'll be more resources that I'll introduce at the end, but for now we're going out with the Forest Trees of Maine as a guide, and I'm taking a hand lens so I can look closely at the twigs. And I would just love for you to come with me. And by the end of the morning, we'll take this alphabet of trees that we've learned and start to understand how to translate them into stories about the landscape. So one of the things I really like about white pine is I think of them as like the dancers of the pine family. Like they throw their arms out really widely. To get to the pine family, we know that the needles are in bundles. That's what makes it a pine. And we know that the needles are 5. So there are 5 needles in a bundle. An easy way to remember that is white has 5 letters. So the white pines too, if you look out across the landscape, they're the ones that stand up above the other trees. So if you don't have a person go out with you to learn trees from, your local forester or someone leading a tree ID walk, and this is a winter season, so I will be using today the Forest Trees of Maine guide, which I'm recommending as one of the better guides that I know to our part of the world. And so let's just see what happens when we try to key pine with this guide. We're keying out this white pine that's behind me. So first of all, just to know, there are 2 keys. There's a summer key and a winter key, and basically it's does the tree have leaves or not if it's deciduous, but with pine it doesn't really matter. So the first question is, and you're choosing between 2 in most cases, the leaves are evergreen or the leaves are deciduous. So that's a very early division that you find in the winter trees. These are clearly evergreen. The needles are still green through the winter. The second choice is leaves are needle or scale-like. The fruit is a cone, or the leaves are broad and flat and often curled in winter. So these are needle-like, and the fruit is a cone. It has needles, and so since it has needles, I jumped down to 4. They are definitely needle-like. That takes me to question number 5, which is, are they in clusters of 2, 3, or 5? With a papery sheath at the base, and it is true, all that is true. And so it takes us to pine, 25 to 36, and right away we're into the pine world. And then once you get to page 25, there are a few other questions that it asks you, and right away it's like, are they slender, flexible, and 3 to 5 inches? Are there 5 of them in a cluster? And right away we know we're at eastern white pine. So this particular tree really behaved nicely as we took it through the key. We'll see what happens as we go in to look at some other ones. The next couple of trees I want to look at on our tree tour today at beautiful Rock Point are trees that have very distinctive bark. Sometimes there's a characteristic about a tree that once you learn it, you just recognize it instantly. And this tree, as we look up, we can see it has needles. It is a red pine, but it has this very distinctive jigsaw puzzle bark. You feel like you can flake off a piece of this bark and figure out where it went before and put it back almost. So this is partly adapted to fire. These trees tend to grow on dry, sandy landscapes, if they're not planted, which they also were planted in the 30s in these red pine plantations that you can see around Vermont. Those trees, of course, are in rows, and they're kind of a monoculture. But naturally occurring stands of red pine are the result of fire. I was looking at the ground and I found a twig on the ground. I just want to share that, especially in well-traveled and loved places, I prefer not to break off the branches of trees. I look around and try to find something that I can notice on the ground. And this was on the ground, and you can see the needles are in bundles. They're connected together. They have this papery sheath at the base. And this one has 2 needles. And so 2 needles indicate that it is a red pine. These are beautiful trees, and if you learn the bark, you'll just know them wherever you go. Another tree that has very distinctive bark that once you learn it, it's just easy to recognize, is this tree, and people say if they had to give it a name they'd call it Shaggy, and it is Shaggy. It's a shagbark hickory, and these trees, they have the center of their range further south, so we tend to find them in the Champlain Valley on warmer, drier sites. So they're most successful where there's shallow soil, it warms up quickly, maybe some lake effect from Lake Champlain, all tend to make this site a little warmer than other sites, and so here we have it. I mainly go on the bark. Mainly I want to show too that their habitat, and this shagbarks in particularly are good habitat for Indiana bats, or birds like brown creepers can nest up under these shakes. But Indiana bats come over in the springtime a little later than now with their pups after they've overwintered in the Adirondacks, and they'll leave the pups up under the shake, and they'll go out flying out to hunt for mosquitoes and get dinner. And so there are nursery trees in Vermont that have as many as 300 individual bats using them for roost habitat. Paper and gray birch are hard to tell apart. If they're in leaf, you can definitely tell. The paper birch have more of an oval leaf. The gray birch are triangular at the base, and they come to a really sharp drip tip. So this tree is a paper birch. I can tell for several reasons. One is it's starting to have peely bark. The chevrons, the kind of mustaches where the branches have broken off, are not really well defined in this individual. Often in gray birch, those are very distinctive black droopy mustaches that come off where the lower branches have fallen off. And as you look up, the last thing that tells me decisively is this has catkins coming out in threes. So they come out almost like a bird foot, the fruiting bodies off of the end of the branches. And gray birch only have 1 or 2, and they're kind of stubby. And these are fairly long, and they're in some of them are in threes. They aren't always in threes, but if you see any threes, you're looking at a paper birch. And what they tell us about the landscape is there's been some kind of disturbance here. The seeds are very small. The seeds fall everywhere, but they germinate on bare mineral soil. So something happened here a little while ago as you look around at this grove of paper birch that made this an open landscape where the soil was disturbed and they could land right on the surface of it. Here in the Champlain Valley, the cottonwoods become really large, stately, majestic trees, especially along bodies of water. Again, a pioneer species in the poplar family. They have the flattened petiole and wave their leaves. You can see, how to tell them from the quaking aspen is, clearly, the bark becomes furrowed more quickly. This tree may not be super old. They grow really fast, so this tree might be less than 100 years old, but still quite large. So flatter across the bottom, Latin for them is deltoides, so their leaf tends to look like the fan shape of a delta. Here's their twigs, very fat buds. We'll get a image of them looking up from below, and you can really see how big these buds are. They're resinous. The twigs are rather knobby where the leaves have fallen off. So Cottonwood. This tree is one of my favorites from a bud perspective. I just love the buds on this tree. It's got this sulfur-colored yellow bud that if you kind of brush it with your fingers gently, smells like gin. It has a very distinctive berry sort of alcohol almost aroma. So good smelling tree. It's a bitternut hickory. So again, a hickory that we would be more likely to find further south. But here it is in the Champlain Valley. If you look up, you'll see the bitternut hickory cankers on it. So if you're walking through the woods and you see these black cankers in a tree, it's a key way to identify a bitternut hickory. So that's one thing. And then also there will be probably husks from the nuts on the ground. So we can look around for that. It tends to have a fairly smooth striped bark when it's young, but then as it gets older it starts to be more platy, like what we're looking at here. And this is a nice example of a bitternut hickory. This tree is an iconic Vermont tree, and just by saying that I'm guessing that many of you might realize that it's a maple. The sugar maple, one thing, I'll get to the bud in just a second, but one thing that is distinctive about it, has the classic maple sort of Canada flag leaf, has these U-shaped sinuses. They're just softly curved, which is different than the red maple or the silver maple, some of the other maples we'd be distinguishing it from. So that nice U-shaped sinus in the leaf is a clue. The opposite branching is a classic maple thing to do. So the twigs are coming out in pairs. On the sugar maple, the bud is a sharp, pointy bud with scales on it. I think of it kind of as an upside down ice cream cone. So that's a good way to tell it. What do they tell us about the landscape? They tend to naturally occur in areas that have rich soils. The soils are what they call sweet. So the pH is higher, the nutrients are more available. Just classic, beautiful, round canopy when they're open grown. Of course, the sap is valuable for the syrup that we create with it. But also squirrels will sometimes tap red maples and sugar maples in the winter, and the sap will collect in kind of an icicle, and they'll come back and they'll eat it and lick it like an ice cream cone. I'm standing here near a white oak, and you can see around the other side, the sides of the tree, the bark is very light colored. And if you go in the woods and you squint and look around the woods, and if you're seeing the lighter colored trees, and they're not paper birch and they're not aspens, they're white oaks. White oaks as a group have the really sweeter acorns. Here's a red oak leaf. You can see the white oaks are more rounded at the tips, and the red oaks tend to have more pointy tips. And there are a variety of trees in both of these groups. But the white oak acorns will hit the ground in the fall. They germinate immediately. They don't wait out the winter to germinate. But the gray squirrels will tend to cache the red oaks, and blue jays do this too, and save them for the winter, and they eat the white oaks right away. So people have said to me that when they want to go out and try to make white oak acorn flour, it's actually hard to find white oak acorns because they're so popular. This one has this interesting red-brown stripe on it, though. It is called a squirrel stripe. And if I look closely, I can see places where the gray squirrels have bit it. And they use it as a message board. They come in and they bite it, and they rub their cheeks on it, and they leave a scent on it. It's kind of like a way of messaging each other. You know, I'm here, this is my territory, here's my tree. Also, perhaps I'm available, you know, if they're in mating season. As I've learned to identify individual trees, I kind of think of them as the letters of the alphabet. And that as time goes on, you can start to put those letters together and tell a story, like you can start to read the landscape. And this is the one tree in this landscape that we're visiting today, Rock Point, that tells me a story, which is this tree, the low branches of this white oak tell me that this tree was open grown. So I know that I'm standing in an old pasture where this tree grew up in the sunlight without competition from other trees. And now these other trees have grown up around it, and they're all growing up straight and tall and going for the sunlight because they're competing with each other. They're trying to all get sunlight. But this tree stood alone. It's a wolf tree. Many of Vermont forests are overgrown pasture, and you can find wolf trees like this one in them. We've come to the end of our hike today, and we've stopped at this final point at Rock Point along the edge of the cliffs in what is a limestone bluff cedar pine forest, which is a natural community name. It's a very distinctive community that hugs the edge of the cliffs here. You can see it behind me, and you can tell right away you're not standing in the vanilla woods of Vermont. There's something really different about this place. It's dominated by these white cedar, an excellent reference for natural communities, which is how you find individual trees and individual other plants and animals assembling on the landscape in repeated patterns. But one of the first things I've learned to look at with the white cedar, besides the flat, feathery scales, is that it has generally a kind of oval-shaped trunk. They can be gnarled and twisted and hanging out over the cliffs in the wind. They're incredibly good at rooting. Their strategy is to live here forever. So white cedar, again, kind of oval at the base, flatter needles. It has the cones, which you can often find littered on the ground. Let's walk over to the red cedar. Similar bark. Squirrels tend to strip it off and use it, red squirrels, for their nesting material. A little more peely bark. But what I notice most are the lobes in this tree. This tree is not like a nice smooth oval. This tree, if you cut it, would look like the flower that a child might draw. It's a bunch of lobes coming up together into a single trunk. The trees, red and white cedar, are found together. Red cedar, though, if you find a grove of them, often they grow up in pastures that were grazed intensively and then they kind of let go. And the cows won't eat red cedar, so they let it kind of grow up into trees. Red cedar, white cedar, limestone bluff cedar pine forest. Go out and tackle those natural communities.